They tell you that when you leave the war behind. They tell you that the sound of gunfire fades. That the smell of burning copper and dust washes out of your clothes. And that the hypervigilance, the way your eyes scan every rooftop, every shadow, eventually softens. They lie. Jordan Hale knew they lied. That's why she didn't just move back to the suburbs of Seattle after her third tour in Afghanistan. She took her 6-year-old son, Theo, and she ran to the edge of the world. Or, at least, the edge of the Washington Cascades. A cabin built of heavy timber, surrounded by 200 acres of dense, unforgiving, beautifully silent pine forest. Here, the only explosions were thunderclaps. The only enemies were the harsh winters. Jordan was a single mother, a former Marine sergeant, a woman whose soul had been fractured by the desert, slowly being glued back together by the sweet, innocent laugh of her little boy. Theo was her anchor, with his unruly mop of brown hair and eyes wide with wonder. He was the only reason she remembered how to smile. And then, there was Scout, a German shepherd mix with one floppy ear and a heart too big for his ribs. He was a rescue, but Jordan often wondered who had actually rescued whom. It was supposed to be a safe haven, a place where the monsters of the world couldn't find them. But the thing about monsters, Jordan would soon learn, is that they don't always live in the deserts of a war-torn country. Sometimes, they live right in your backyard. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The kind of day where the air bites at your cheeks and the sky is a heavy, bruised purple, promising rain. Jordan stood on the back porch, a steaming mug of black coffee in her hands. She wore a faded flannel shirt over her thermal Henley, her dark hair pulled back into a messy knot. Below her, in the sprawling backyard that bled seamlessly into the dark tree line, Theo was throwing a frayed tennis ball for Scout. "Go get it, boy." Theo's voice was a bright, ringing bell against the quiet of the woods. Scout bounded forward, a blur of gold and black fur, chasing the neon green sphere as it bounced and disappeared into the thick underbrush of the tree line. Jordan watched them, a soft, rare smile touching the corners of her mouth. "This is good," she told herself. "This is peace." But 5 minutes passed, then 10. Theo trotted back to the porch, his small face scrunched in confusion. "Mom? Scout didn't come back with the ball. I called him, but he's ignoring me." Jordan's smile faded. The veteran in her, the part of her brain that never truly slept, twitched. Scout was obedient to a fault. He never ignored a command, especially from Theo. "Stay here on the porch, buddy," Jordan said, setting her coffee mug on the wooden railing. "I'll go get him." She stepped off the porch, her heavy boots crunching against the frost-kissed grass. As she approached the edge of the woods, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The towering Douglas firs created a canopy that blocked out the pale afternoon sun, casting the forest floor in a perpetual, eerie twilight. "Scout," Jordan called out, her voice firm, carrying the authoritative tone of a squad leader. "Here, boy." Silence. Not just a lack of barking, but a deep, unnatural silence. The birds had stopped singing. The squirrels weren't chattering. The woods were holding their breath. Jordan's pulse quickened. Her training kicked in. She stopped walking, closed her eyes for a split second, and listened. Scrape, scrape, whimper. It was faint, coming from a thicket of blackberry bushes about 50 yards deep. Jordan pushed through the thorny branches, ignoring the sting as they snagged her jeans. "Scout," "What are you doing?" she muttered, breaking into a small clearing. What she saw made her blood run cold. Scout was digging, not playfully, frantically. His paws were a blur as he kicked up dark, damp earth, whining in a high, distressed pitch. And then, the smell hit her. It was a scent Jordan knew intimately. A scent she had spent years in therapy trying to forget. It wasn't the smell of a dead animal. It was heavy, sweet, and metallic. It was the distinct, undeniable stench of human decay. "Scout, no, leave it," Jordan barked, lunging forward and grabbing the dog by his heavy leather collar, hauling him backward. Scout fought her for a second, barking wildly at the hole he had created, before finally sitting, his body trembling. Jordan looked down into the shallow crater of disturbed earth. The soil was loose, recently turned, and protruding from the dark dirt, brushed clean by the dog's frantic paws, was a sliver of pale, mottled white bone. But it wasn't just a bone. Tangled around it was a piece of fabric, a scrap of a blue, floral patterned dress, and just beneath that, a silver chain reflecting the dim forest light. Jordan's breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She took a step back, her hand instinctively moving to her hip where her sidearm usually rested, but she was unarmed. She was just a mother in the woods. She looked around, her eyes darting through the trees. The shadows suddenly looked like silhouettes. The wind sounded like footsteps. Someone had buried a woman here, recently, and they had chosen Jordan's land to do it. "Come on," Jordan whispered to the dog, her voice tight with panic. "We have to go, now." The local sheriff, a weary man named Miller, had arrived within the hour. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, her property was crawling with deputies and crime scene technicians. They confirmed Jordan's worst fear. It was a grave, and according to the hushed, grim conversations Jordan overheard, it wasn't just one body. The earth in that clearing was soft in multiple places. "I'm sorry, Ms. Hale," Sheriff Miller had said, taking off his Stetson, his face pale under the flashing red and blue lights of the cruisers. "We've got to bring in the state boys. This is bigger than anything we've ever seen. We'll be out there all night setting up floodlights." "Are we safe in the house?" Jordan had asked, holding Theo tightly against her leg. "My men will be in the woods a half-mile back," Miller assured her, "but lock your doors. Keep the boy inside. Whoever did this, they think this is a safe dumping ground. They don't want to be seen." By 10 p.m., the storm that the bruised sky had promised finally broke. The rain came down in sheets, hammering against the tin roof of the cabin like a barrage of bullets. The crime scene deep in the woods was awash of mud, halting the investigation until dawn. The deputies had retreated to their vehicles down the main highway, leaving Jordan's cabin isolated in the deluge. Jordan put Theo to bed. She read him a story about dragons and knights, keeping her voice steady, burying the terror deep in her chest. She kissed his forehead, smoothing his hair. "I love you, Mom," Theo mumbled, his eyes already heavy. "I love you more, buddy. I'm right outside," she whispered. Once his door was shut, the soldier took over. Jordan walked to the gun safe in the hallway. Her fingers flew across the keypad. Beep 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 beep. She pulled out her Glock 19, checked the magazine, full, and chambered a round. She set it on the kitchen island. Then, she retrieved her Remington 870 pump-action shotgun. She loaded it with heavy buckshot. the clack-clack of the action sounding violently loud in the quiet house. She turned off all the interior lights. If someone was out there in the dark, she wasn't going to give them the advantage of seeing her. She sat in the armchair facing the front door, the shotgun resting across her lap. Scout lay at her feet, his ears pinned back, sensing his mother's profound anxiety. Midnight passed. The rain lashed against the windows. 1 a.m. Jordan's eyelids grew heavy, the adrenaline slowly wearing off, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. Jordan snapped awake. Scout was standing. The hair on the back of his neck was standing straight up, forming a ridge of bristling fur. He wasn't looking toward the woods in the back. He was staring dead at the heavy oak front door. Scout let out another growl, deeper this time, vibrating in his chest. He bared his teeth. Jordan's heart leapt into her throat. She stood up slowly, the shotgun rising to her shoulder. She moved silently, placing herself between the front door and the hallway leading to Theo's room. Through the roar of the rain, she strained to listen. Crunch. A footstep on the gravel driveway. Creak. The weight of a body stepping onto the wooden planks of her front porch. Jordan held her breath. Her finger hovered just outside the trigger guard. The darkness in the cabin felt suffocating. Whoever was out there had walked past the police perimeter. Whoever was out there wasn't seeking shelter from the storm. Then came the sound. Not a frantic banging of someone needing help. Not the authoritative rap of a police officer. It was slow, deliberate, taunting. Knock. 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 A voice, muffled by the heavy wood and the driving rain, drifted through the door. It was a man's voice. Smooth, calm, and chillingly polite. "Jordan, I know you're awake. Your dog found something that belongs to me. I think it's only fair I come in to collect it." "Jordan, I know you're awake." The voice outside the door was maddeningly calm. It didn't belong to a desperate fugitive. It belonged to a predator who believed he had already trapped his prey. For 3 agonizing seconds, Jordan Hale didn't breathe. The civilian part of her, the mother who baked cookies and helped Theo with his math homework, screamed in terror. But that part of her was quickly violently shoved aside. The Marine took over. Her heart rate, which had been hammering against her ribs just moments before, inexplicably slowed. Her vision tunneled, the edges of the dark cabin sharpening into high contrast. The training she thought she had left in the dust of Kandahar flooded her veins like ice water. She didn't speak. Answering him would give away her exact position. Instead, she issued a sharp, silent hand signal to Scout, a flat palm pushed downward. "Stay down." The German shepherd obeyed instantly. Dropping to his belly, though a low, rumbling growl continued to vibrate in his throat. His eyes never left the front door. "I'm not going to ask twice." "Jordan." The voice drifted through the heavy oak again, barely audible over the torrential downpour. "Unlock the door. Let's not make this messy in front of the boy. He knows about Theo." A cold fury ignited in Jordan's chest. The fear was gone, replaced by a lethal, calculating anger. She shifted her weight, raising the Remington 870 to her shoulder. She aimed center mass at the door, right where a man's chest would be. "Come on," she thought. "Kick it, see what happens." But the kick never came. Instead, there was a sharp, mechanical clack from the side of the house. Instantly, the faint hum of the refrigerator died. The glowing red numbers on the microwave vanished. The digital clock on the wall went blank. He had cut the breaker. The cabin was plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. Jordan didn't panic. She knew this house blindfolded. She knew which floorboards creaked and how many steps it took to get from the living room to Theo's bedroom. She backed up slowly, moving out of the fatal funnel, the direct line of sight from the doorway where most casualties occur during a breach. She positioned herself behind the heavy stone of the fireplace, a perfect vantage point that covered both the front door and the hallway. Crash! The sound of shattering glass erupted from the back of the cabin, the kitchen window. Scout barked wildly, scrambling to his feet, ready to charge toward the kitchen. "Scout, no, heel," Jordan whispered fiercely. It was a distraction, a textbook tactical diversion. He wanted her to run to the kitchen so he could come through the front. No sooner had the thought crossed her mind than the front door exploded inward. Lightning flashed, illuminating the doorway for a fraction of a second. In that strobe light glare, Jordan saw him, a tall, broad silhouette, dripping wet, wearing a dark raincoat and a ski mask. In his right hand, a suppressed pistol. In his left, a heavy hunting knife. He stepped into the cabin, moving with a practiced, predatory grace. Jordan didn't hesitate. She didn't read him his rights. She didn't fire a warning shot. She pulled the trigger. Boom! The blast of the 12-gauge shotgun in the enclosed space of the cabin was deafening. A massive tongue of orange flame illuminated the room, casting grotesque, dancing shadows against the walls. A cloud of buckshot tore through the air. But the killer was fast. Unnaturally fast. As Jordan fired, he dove hard to the left, rolling behind the heavy leather sofa in the center of the living room. The buckshot shredded the doorframe and the wall behind him, raining plaster and splinters onto the hardwood floor. "Goddamit!" a voice hissed from behind the couch. He was hit, but not lethally. Maybe a stray pellet to the arm or shoulder. Thwip, thwip. Two suppressed shots coughed from behind the sofa. The bullets chewed into the stone of the fireplace right next to Jordan's head, sending sharp shards of rock slicing across her cheek. She flinched, blood welling up and trickling down her jaw. But she pumped the shotgun. Clack clack. The empty shell casing hit the floor. A fresh round entered the chamber. "Mom?" Jordan's blood froze. Theo's voice, small and trembling, cried out from down the dark hallway. The gunfire had woken him. "Theo, stay under the bed, do not come out," Jordan screamed, abandoning her tactical silence. The killer laughed. It was a wet, raspy sound, a mother's love. He mocked from the darkness. "Let's see how far it goes." He scrambled from behind the couch, making a break not for Jordan, but for the hallway. He was going for the boy. "Scout, attack," Jordan commanded. The German Shepherd launched himself like a furry missile. 70 pounds of muscle and teeth slammed into the killer's chest just as he reached the mouth of the hallway. The man grunted heavily as the dog took him down to the hardwood floor. Scout went straight for the arm holding the pistol, his jaws clamping down with bone-crushing force. The killer roared in pain, dropping the gun. "Get off me, you mutt!" In the chaotic tangle of limbs and shadows, Jordan couldn't risk a shotgun blast. She would hit Scout. She dropped the Remington, letting it hang by its tactical sling, and drew the Glock 19 from her holster. She moved forward, pieing the corner, trying to get a clear shot. Lightning flashed again. The killer had managed to free his left hand. The hunting knife flashed in the strobe light. He drove the blade upward. Scout let out a high-pitched, agonizing yelp. His jaws went slack, and the dog collapsed onto his side, a dark pool spreading rapidly across the floorboards. "No!" Jordan screamed. She raised the Glock, the tritium night sights glowing faintly green, aligning perfectly with the center of the killer's masked face. But before she could squeeze the trigger, the man kicked the heavy wooden coffee table directly into her shins. Jordan lost her balance, stumbling backward. The killer didn't press the attack. He knew he had lost the element of surprise. He scrambled to his feet, clutching his bleeding arm, and threw himself back out the shattered front door, disappearing into the raging storm. Jordan didn't chase him. The golden rule of defense: you never abandon the VIP. And her VIP was down the hall. She kept her gun aimed at the empty doorway, moving backward toward Scout. The dog was breathing shallowly, a whimpering sound escaping his throat. "Hold on, buddy. I've got you. I've got you," she choked out, sliding her hand over the wound on his flank to apply pressure. It was deep, but it hadn't hit a major artery. He would live, if she could stop the bleeding. The storm raged on outside, the wind howling through the broken front door, soaking the living room. Jordan sat in the dark, her hands covered in her dog's blood, her gun gripped so tightly her knuckles were white. The killer had retreated, but she knew the truth. He wasn't running away. He was regrouping. He knew she was armed. He knew she was trained. And now, the real hunt was about to begin. The wind howled through the splintered remains of the front door, carrying the freezing October rain into the living room. Puddles were already forming on the hardwood floor, mixing with the dark, spreading stain of Scout's blood. Jordan Hale didn't have time to panic. Panic was a luxury for people who had someone coming to save them. The police perimeter was half a mile down a muddy logging road, and the thunder was completely masking the sound of gunfire. No one was coming. She was on her own. "Theo," Jordan called out, her voice low but piercing enough to cut through the storm. "I need you to come here. Buddy, keep low to the ground. Crawl." A moment later, a small, trembling figure emerged from the hallway shadows. Theo was clutching his stuffed bear, his eyes wide with a terror no 6-year-old should ever know. He saw the blood. He saw Scout. A sob ripped from his throat. "Mommy. Hey, look at me," Jordan commanded gently, holstering her Glock and grabbing her son by the shoulders. She forced him to meet her eyes. "Scout is hurt, but he is strong. I am going to fix him. But I need my brave boy right now. Can you be brave for me?" Theo swallowed hard, tears streaking his dirt-smudged cheeks, and nodded. "Good," Jordan said. "Go to the bathroom at the end of the hall. Get inside the cast-iron bathtub. Take this blanket. Do not come out until I say your name 3 times. 3 times. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mom." Once Theo was secure in the most heavily reinforced room in the cabin, Jordan turned back to Scout. She sprinted to the kitchen, dodging the broken glass from the window the killer had shattered earlier, and yanked open the pantry. Hidden behind the canned beans and pasta was her IFAK, her individual first aid kit from her deployment days. She ripped it open, pulling out a packet of quick-clot combat gauze and a pressure dressing. She slid back across the wet floor to the German Shepherd. "Easy, boy. This is going to burn," she whispered, her hands working with mechanical precision. Scout whined piteously as she packed the hemostatic gauze directly into the stab wound on his flank. The chemical agent immediately went to work, accelerating the blood clotting process. She wrapped the pressure dressing tight, securing it around his torso. The bleeding slowed to a stop. Scout rested his heavy head on her knee, his breathing stabilizing. "Good boy." She kissed the top of his head. "Stay down." Now, the medic stepped back, and the tactician took over. The killer was out there in the dark. He was wounded, but he was armed, and he was angry. He knew the layout of the front room now. If he came back, it wouldn't be a reckless frontal assault. It would be a calculated breach. Jordan needed to change the rules of engagement. She needed to turn her home into a nightmare for anyone trying to enter. First, the perimeter. She couldn't fix the front door, but she could make it impassable. Putting her shoulder against the massive, solid oak dining table, she drove with her legs, pushing it across the room until it wedged tightly against the splintered doorframe. She stacked 2 heavy armchairs on top of it. It wouldn't stop a bullet, but it would create a loud, clumsy barricade. Anyone climbing over it would be a sitting duck. Next, the fatal funnels. In close quarters combat, doors and windows are death traps. Jordan moved to the kitchen. She took the remaining glass from the shattered window and used the butt of her pistol to smash it into jagged, unpredictable shards. She spread the broken glass evenly across the floor beneath the window sill. In the pitch black, rubber-soled boots would still crunch loudly on glass. An early warning system. She didn't stop there. She grabbed a spool of heavy-duty fishing line from her tackle box. She tied it taut across the bottom of the hallway entrance, about 4 inches off the ground. A simple tripwire. To the end of the line, she rigged a heavy cast iron skillet, balanced precariously on the edge of a bookshelf. If he hit the wire, 80 pounds of cast iron would crash to the floor. Finally, she needed the ultimate advantage. Jordan moved to the master bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of her dresser. Beneath her folded sweaters was a locked Pelican case. She keyed in the combination. Inside rested a piece of equipment she had legally purchased after leaving the military, hoping she'd never need it. A PVS-14 night vision monocular, complete with a tactical skull crusher mount. She strapped the harness to her head and flipped the monocular down over her right eye. She hit the power button. The pitch-black cabin instantly transformed into a crisp, glowing sea of emerald green. Every shadow was erased. Every detail of the living room was razor-sharp. She could see the dust motes hanging in the air. She could see the trail of muddy footprints the killer had left behind. She was no longer a blind target in the dark. She was the apex predator. Jordan grabbed her Remington 870 shotgun, pumped a fresh shell into the chamber, and took a kneeling position behind the kitchen island. From here, she had a clear line of sight to the barricaded front door, the shattered kitchen window, and the hallway leading to Theo. She checked her watch. 2:15 a.m. The storm raged on. For 20 minutes. There was nothing but the sound of the rain and her own steady, controlled breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Then, something changed. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling, the subtle shift in air pressure. Jordan's green-tinted vision scanned the room. Nothing. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her smartphone. There was no cellular service. But she didn't need it. The phone was connected via an offline, battery-powered intranet to the 3 trail cameras she had mounted on the trees around the property line. She opened the app. The screen was dark, struggling with the heavy rain. She toggled to camera 1, the driveway. Empty. She toggled to camera 2, the backyard edge. Empty. She toggled to camera 3, the thicket where Scout had found the grave. Jordan's breath caught in her throat. The infrared night vision of the trail camera illuminated a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, staring directly into the lens. It was him. But he wasn't alone. Standing next to him, holding a high-powered rifle wrapped in waterproof tape, was a second man, the first killer, his arm hastily bandaged with duct tape, pointed a long, serrated hunting knife straight at the camera. He knew she was watching. He raised his hand and slowly drew a finger across his throat. Then, both men stepped out of the camera's frame, melting into the stormy darkness, heading straight for the back of the cabin. Jordan lowered the phone. She clicked the safety off her shotgun. 2 targets, she whispered to herself, the green glow of her night vision reflecting in the dark. Come and get it. Through the emerald green lens of her PVS-14 night vision, Jordan Hale watched the world in hyperfocus. The living room was a ghost town of sharp lines and glowing shadows. Her breathing was steady, in through the nose, out through the mouth. She had 2 targets, one armed with a hunting knife and a suppressed pistol, already nursing a wounded arm, the other carrying a high-powered rifle. In a fair fight, out in the open, they had the advantage. But this wasn't the open. This was her house. And Jordan didn't fight fair. It came from the back of the house. The mudroom. Jordan shifted her weight, bringing the stock of the Remington 870 tight against her shoulder. The mudroom connected to the kitchen, right where she had laid her trap of shattered glass. Click. The lock on the back door gave way. They had picked it. Smart. They weren't going to make the same mistake of kicking down a door and announcing their entry. The heavy wooden door creaked open, just a fraction of an inch, letting in a gust of freezing wind that rustled the curtains in the kitchen. Jordan held her fire. Patience, the sergeant in her whispered. Let them enter the fatal funnel. Let them commit. 2 figures slipped through the narrow opening, melting into the kitchen like ink spreading in water. In her night vision, they glowed brightly against the cold background of the unheated mudroom. The first man, the original killer, moved point. He held his suppressed pistol tightly, his wounded left arm bound in silver duct tape. The second man followed closely, the long barrel of his hunting rifle sweeping the room. They were moving with agonizing slowness, their rubber-soled boots making almost no sound on the linoleum floor. They were professionals, or, at least, experienced hunters. But hunters are used to tracking prey that runs. They aren't used to prey that sets ambushes. The first man took a step forward, moving past the kitchen island, heading toward the living room archway. His boot came down squarely on the jagged shards of the broken window pane Jordan had scattered across the floor. The man froze, a sharp hiss escaping his lips. It was all the confirmation Jordan needed. Contact, she whispered. She stood up from her crouched position behind the island, the shotgun leveled. The element of surprise was a weapon, and she wielded it with lethal precision. Boom! The 12-gauge roared in the confined space. The muzzle flash was blinding, even through the auto-gating feature of her night vision goggles. The blast caught the second man, the one with the rifle, square in the chest. He didn't even have time to scream. The sheer kinetic energy of the buckshot lifted him off his feet, throwing him backward into the mudroom door with a sickening crunch. He slid to the floor, leaving a dark, glowing smear on the wall in Jordan's NVG display. 1 down. Before the echo of the blast could fade, the first killer reacted. He didn't retreat. He lunged forward, firing blindly into the dark toward the muzzle flash. Thwip, thwip, thwip. Bullets tore through the air, shattering the wooden cabinets above Jordan's head and sending a shower of splinters raining down on her. She dropped fast, ducking behind the thick oak of the island, pumping the shotgun. Clack, clack. "You bitch," the killer roared, his calm facade completely shattered. He was rushing her, moving fast down the short hallway that connected the kitchen to the living room. He was angry. Angry men make mistakes. He didn't check his footing. He didn't look down. His shin caught the taut, invisible fishing line Jordan had strung across the hallway entrance. The tripwire gave way. The 80-pound cast iron skillet, balanced precariously on the top shelf, plummeted like a stone. It struck the killer squarely on the right shoulder with the force of a sledgehammer. He screamed, a raw, guttural sound of pure agony, and collapsed hard onto the hardwood floor. Dropping his pistol, Jordan didn't hesitate. She stepped out from cover, her shotgun aimed directly at the man writhing on the ground. But as she moved, a violent crack of thunder shook the cabin, and lightning illuminated the room. In that split second of blinding white light, the killer looked up. He saw the green lenses of her night vision goggles. He realized he was utterly outmatched in the dark. With a desperate, animalistic roar, he reached into his tactical vest, pulled a heavy, metallic cylinder, and yanked the pin. Jordan's eyes widened behind her goggles. A flashbang. "Cover," she yelled to nobody but herself. She turned away and squeezed her eyes shut. But it was too late. The stun grenade detonated in the small hallway. The concussive wave hit Jordan like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs and sending her crashing backward into the wall. Her night vision goggles instantly overloaded from the intense burst of light, the safety mechanism kicking in and shutting the device down. Total, suffocating darkness returned. Jordan lay on the floor, her ears ringing so loudly she couldn't hear the rain. Her vision was swimming with purple and white spots. She tried to grip her shotgun, but her fingers felt numb. Through the dizzying fog of the flashbang, she felt a vibration on the floorboards. Heavy footsteps, moving toward her. The killer had been prepared for the blast. He had closed his eyes and turned away. Jordan forced herself to roll over. Her Marine training fought through the disorientation. Get up, move, survive. She blindly reached for the holster on her hip. The Glock 19. Her fingers closed around the textured grip just as a heavy boot kicked her squarely in the ribs. Jordan gasped, the pain sharp and breathtaking. But she held onto the gun. A hand grabbed her by the collar of her shirt, hauling her roughly off the floor. She could smell him now, wet wool, sweat, and the metallic tang of blood. "You've been a real pain in the ass, Jordan," his voice hissed in her ear. No longer calm, but dripping with malice. She felt the cold, sharp edge of his hunting knife press against the skin of her throat. "Mom?" The faint, muffled cry came from the bathroom at the end of the hall. Theo. He had heard the explosion. The killer chuckled, a wet, rattling sound. "Good. The boy is awake. I want him to hear this." He pulled his arm back to drive the blade home. But Jordan Hale wasn't a victim. She was a mother cornered. And there is nothing on earth more dangerous. Ignoring the blade at her neck, Jordan didn't pull away. She leaned in. With her free left hand, she jammed her thumb brutally into the wound on his shoulder. right where the cast iron skillet had hit him. The man shrieked, his grip faltering for a microsecond. It was all the time Jordan needed. She brought the Glock up from her hip, pressing the muzzle directly against the side of his ribcage, and squeezed the trigger twice. Bang, 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 bang. The twin reports of the Glock 19 echoed in the tight, smoke-filled hallway, deafeningly loud after the concussion of the flashbang. For a second that felt stretched into an eternity, nothing happened. The heavy weight of the killer remained pressed against Jordan, his ragged breath hot against her cheek. The cold steel of the hunting knife was still resting dangerously close to her carotid artery. Then, the life simply left him. It wasn't like the movies, where the bad guy throws his arms up and flies backward. It was a sudden, absolute loss of tension. The man turned into dead weight, crumbling forward, dragging Jordan down with him to the blood-slicked hardwood floor. Jordan scrambled backward, kicking her legs to get out from under his massive frame. Her chest heaved, pulling in jagged lungfuls of air thick with the smell of sulfur, copper, and wet wool. Her ears were still ringing, a high, continuous whine that dulled the roar of the storm outside. She kept the Glock leveled at his head, her hands shaking violently. The adrenaline dump was hitting her system hard. "Stay down," she rasped, her voice raw. But he wasn't getting up. He lay on his back, staring blindly at the ceiling, a dark, rapidly expanding pool of black ink spreading across his tactical vest. Jordan didn't lower her weapon. She pushed herself up to a crouch, her ribs screaming in protest where he had kicked her. She reached up and ripped the dead night vision goggles off her head. Tossing them aside, they were useless now. Instead, she fumbled for the tactical flashlight mounted on her belt. She clicked it on. The harsh white beam swept the room. It illuminated the shattered front door, the overturned furniture, and the glistening puddle of Scout's blood near the sofa. It swept toward the mudroom, catching the crumpled, motionless form of the second man she had hit with the shotgun blast. Clear. The immediate threat was neutralized. "Mom?" The voice was tiny, muffled behind the heavy wooden door of the bathroom. Jordan's heart, hardened by the violence of the last 10 minutes, instantly cracked open. She holstered her pistol and stumbled down the hallway, leaning heavily against the wall for support. "Theo," she gasped, reaching the door. "Theo, it's me. I'm coming in." She pushed the door open. The beam of her flashlight caught the old cast iron bathtub, curled into a tight ball. Buried under a thick quilt and clutching his teddy bear was her son. He was shaking so hard his teeth were chattering. "Mommy." Theo scrambled out of the tub, disregarding her orders to stay put, and threw his arms around her waist. Jordan dropped to her knees, wincing at the pain in her ribs, and buried her face in his soft hair. "I've got you, baby. I've got you. You were so brave. You did exactly what I asked." "Is the bad man gone?" Theo whispered, his voice hitching with a sob. "Yes," Jordan said firmly, pulling back to look him in the eyes. She wiped a tear from his cheek with a trembling thumb. "He can't hurt us anymore." But as she said the words, her trained senses caught something. Jordan froze. She lifted her head, her nostrils flaring. Beneath the overwhelming stench of gunpowder and blood, there was something else: wood smoke and melting plastic. "Stay right here. Theo, don't move," she commanded, her tone shifting back to the sergeant. She stood up, grabbing her flashlight, and moved back down the hall. As she entered the kitchen, The beam of her light caught a thick, gray haze gathering near the ceiling. It was coming from the mudroom. When the second man had been thrown backward by the shotgun blast, he had crashed into the heavy utility shelves. He must have knocked over the spare canisters of kerosene Jordan kept for the winter generator. And with the sparks from the firefight, flames, bright orange and hungry, were already licking up the wooden paneled walls of the mudroom, greedily consuming the spilled fuel. The fire was spreading fast, eating through the dried timber of the old cabin with terrifying speed. They couldn't stay. The fortified house she had turned into a bunker was now a death trap. "Theo, we have to go now," Jordan yelled, running back toward the bathroom. "What about Scout?" Theo cried, emerging from the hallway, his eyes wide as he saw the orange glow reflecting off the kitchen walls. Jordan looked at the living room. Scout was still lying there, breathing shallowly, his side heavily bandaged. He was 70 pounds of dead weight. Jordan was injured, exhausted, and had a 6-year-old to protect. In combat, you sometimes have to leave the wounded behind to save the unit. But this wasn't just a unit. This was her family. "We are not leaving him," Jordan growled. She holstered her flashlight and sprinted to the dog. "Come on, buddy. I need you to help me out here." She grabbed the thick nylon harness on Scout's back and heaved. The dog whined in pain, struggling to get his paws under him, but managed to stand, leaning heavily against Jordan's leg. "Theo, grab my belt," Jordan ordered. "Do not let go, no matter what happens. Understand?" Theo grabbed the thick leather belt of her jeans, his small fist white-knuckled. The heat in the cabin was becoming unbearable. The smoke was dropping lower, stinging their eyes and burning their throats. The roar of the fire was beginning to rival the thunder outside. Supporting Scout with her left arm and drawing her Glock with her right, Jordan kicked her way through the debris of the barricaded front door. They stepped out onto the porch, immediately assaulted by the freezing, torrential rain. The contrast from the blistering heat of the cabin was a shock to the system. Jordan took a deep breath of the cold, wet air. They were out. They were alive. But as they moved down the steps into the muddy driveway, the storm illuminating the dark woods around them with flashes of lightning, Jordan stopped dead in her tracks. Through the sheets of rain, at the end of her quarter-mile driveway, 2 twin beams of yellow light pierced the darkness. Headlights. Someone was coming, and judging by the heavy, aggressive roar of the engine cutting through the storm, it wasn't Sheriff Miller. The killer from the hallway had warned her. "This is bigger than anything we've ever seen." Jordan pulled Theo closer, her grip tightening on the pistol. The fire roared behind her, consuming the only safe haven she had left. In front of her, the unknown approached in the dark. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just changing shape. The headlights cut through the torrential rain like twin blades, casting long, monstrous shadows across the muddy driveway. Jordan Hale didn't need to see the vehicle to know they were in deep trouble. Her ears, trained by years of convoy duty in hostile territories, instantly identified the sound. It was the deep, throaty rumble of a heavy-duty diesel engine, not the high-pitched whine of Sheriff Miller's Ford Explorer. This was a heavy pickup truck, and it was moving fast, fishtailing in the mud as it accelerated toward the burning cabin. "Move," Jordan hissed. "Into the trees. Now." She didn't wait for Theo to react. She practically lifted the 6-year-old off his feet by the back of his jacket, shoving him toward the dense tree line to their left. With her other hand, She grabbed Scout's heavy nylon harness, hauling the injured German shepherd along. The dog whimpered, his paws slipping in the freezing mud. But he pushed forward, driven by the sheer panic radiating from his mother. They plunged into the thick underbrush just as a matte black Ford F-250 slammed to a halt in the yard. Mere yards from where they had been standing, the truck's high beams illuminated the front of the cabin, which was now fully engulfed. The flames roared into the night sky, hissing viciously against the driving rain, painting the storm in violent shades of orange and red. Jordan dragged Theo and Scout behind the massive, rotting trunk of a fallen cedar tree. About 30 yards deep into the woods, she pressed Theo face down into the wet, freezing ferns. "Don't make a sound, baby," she breathed into his ear. "Not a peep. Hide your face. The whites of your eyes will reflect the light." Theo squeezed his eyes shut and buried his face in the mud, his tiny body trembling violently. Jordan pushed Scout down beside him, keeping a firm hand on the dog's snout to prevent any defensive barking. Peering over the top of the mossy log, Jordan brought her Glock 19 up, resting her forearms on the wood to steady her aim. 4 men stepped out of the truck. They weren't dressed like local thugs or meth heads looking to scrap copper. They wore dark tactical rain gear. Through the haze of smoke and rain, Jordan saw the silhouettes of short-barreled rifles slung across their chests. The driver, a massive man wearing a dark baseball cap, stepped to the front of the truck. He looked at the blazing cabin, then down at the ground. The orange light from the fire illuminated his face. He was angry. "Goddamn," the man roared over the storm. He kicked a discarded piece of the splintered front door. "They failed. The whole place is going up." Another man walked up to the porch steps, shining a high-powered, military-grade flashlight into the roaring inferno of the living room. "I can't see the bodies, boss. But there's no way they survived that heat if they're still inside." The leader looked down at the mud near his boots. Jordan's heart stopped. The torrential rain was washing the tracks away, but it hadn't erased them completely yet. There, perfectly preserved in a patch of thick clay, was the imprint of a small sneaker, and beside it, the dragging paw prints of a bleeding dog. The leader traced the tracks with the beam of his flashlight, following them straight toward the tree line, straight toward the fallen cedar. "They're not in the house," the leader said, his voice dropping to a deadly, calm cadence that chilled Jordan to the bone. He unslung his rifle, pulling the charging handle back with a sharp clack. "The bitch is in the woods. Spread out. Shoot to kill. I want her head. And I want the kid." Jordan ducked back down behind the log. 4 heavily armed men. She had a 9mm pistol with 9 rounds left in the magazine. A wounded dog. And a terrified child. If she stayed here to fight, they would flank her in seconds. It was time to use the one advantage she had, the terrain. These men might be armed to the teeth, but they were outsiders. Jordan knew these 200 acres of forest like the back of her hand. She knew where the ground gave way to marsh, where the blackberry thickets were impassable, and where the old logging roads led to nowhere. "Theo, listen to me," she whispered, her voice a solid anchor in the terrifying dark. "We are going to play a game. It's called Ghost. We move slowly. We stay low, and we don't snap any branches. Can you be a ghost?" Theo gave a microscopic nod against the mud. "Good boy." Jordan turned to the dog. "Come on, Scout. You gotta dig deep for me, buddy." She hauled herself up, staying crouched. She led them deeper into the blackness of the Washington pines. The rain was both a blessing and a curse. It soaked them to the bone, the freezing temperatures threatening hypothermia with every passing minute. But the storm also masked the sound of their movement, swallowing the crunch of dead leaves and the snapping of twigs. For 20 agonizing minutes, they navigated the treacherous terrain. Jordan moved purely by memory and instinct, feeling the slope of the land beneath her boots. She was heading north, toward the ridge. 3 years ago, when she first bought the property, her PTSD had been at its worst. She couldn't sleep, so she had spent her nights building a small, reinforced hunting blind near the top of the rocky ridge, a place where she could watch over the valley. Inside, buried in a waterproof cache, were emergency supplies, dry clothes, MREs, a first aid kit, and most importantly, a fully loaded AR-15 rifle. If they could make it to the ridge, she could turn the tables. She could pick them off one by one as they climbed. Swoosh! A beam of blinding white light swept through the trees about 50 yards behind them, cutting through the rain like a lightsaber. "I've got blood on the ferns over here," a voice shouted from the dark. "The dog is bleeding out. They're heading north." They were tracking Scout's blood trail. Jordan gritted her teeth. She stopped, pulling Theo behind the trunk of a massive Douglas fir. She looked down at the German shepherd. Scout was panting heavily, his tongue lolling out, his eyes glassy. The quick clot had stopped the worst of the arterial bleeding, but the wound was still weeping as he moved. She couldn't carry him. He was too heavy, and the terrain was too steep. But she couldn't leave a trail, either. She had to make a choice. A terrible, tactical choice. Jordan took off her heavy flannel overshirt, leaving her only in her wet thermal Henley. She knelt in the mud and quickly wrapped the thick flannel tightly around Scout's midsection, tying it into a makeshift pressure bandage over his wound to catch the dripping blood. Then, she reached into her pocket. She pulled out the silver chain and the scrap of the blue, floral-patterned dress, the evidence Scout had dug up from the grave just hours ago. The very thing these men had come to destroy. She looked to her right. The land sloped sharply downward toward a rushing, swollen creek. To the left was the steep climb toward the ridge and her hidden weapons cache. Jordan took the bloody scrap of dress and the silver necklace, wiped them heavily in Scout's blood, and tied them to a thick branch pointing directly down toward the creek. It was a classic misdirection. Give the trackers what they want to see. "Let's go," she whispered, shivering violently as the freezing rain lashed against her bare arms. Up the hill. They began the grueling climb. Every step was a battle against gravity and the slippery, unforgiving mud. Theo's breathing was becoming ragged, his little legs failing him. Jordan ended up carrying him on her hip, her muscles screaming in agony from the exertion and the bruised ribs. 10 minutes later, a sharp whistle pierced the storm below them. "Boss, over here, I found the necklace." They went down toward the creek. Jordan paused, leaning heavily against a boulder, her lungs burning. She looked down through the trees. 4 beams of light were converging and rushing down the slope, away from the ridge. The trap had worked. But as Jordan turned to take the final steps toward the rocky overhang where her bunker was hidden, a figure stepped out from the shadows of the rocks, blocking her path. Lightning flashed. Standing 10 feet away, water pouring off a dark poncho, was a 5th man. He hadn't been with the tracking party. He had been waiting for her at the high ground. and he was pointing a shotgun squarely at Theo's chest. "You're a smart girl, Jordan," the man said, racking the pump of his shotgun with a deadly clack-clack. "But not smart enough." "You're a smart girl, Jordan, but not smart enough." The man in the dark poncho stood like a grim reaper against the stormy sky. He had the high ground, the element of surprise, and a 12-gauge shotgun aimed directly at Theo's chest. Time didn't just slow down for Jordan Hale, it fractured. She saw the raindrops exploding against the man's waterproof gear. She saw the white-knuckled grip he had on the forend of the shotgun. And she felt the small, terrifyingly fragile weight of her son pressed against her hip. If she raised her Glock to shoot, the man's reflex would pull the trigger. At this range, buckshot would tear through both her and Theo. Surrender wasn't an option. These men weren't here to take prisoners. They were here to erase a grave, and anyone who knew about it. She needed an edge, a fraction of a second. "Okay," Jordan said, her voice eerily calm, cutting through the roar of the wind. She slowly raised her free left hand, palm open. "You win. Just point that thing at me. Not the kid." The man chuckled, a cruel, hollow sound. "The boss said you were a badass. You just look like a wet, scared mom to me." "I am a scared mom," Jordan agreed, taking a slow, deliberate half-step to her right, physically placing her body between the shotgun barrel and Theo. "But you don't need him. He's 6. He doesn't know anything. He saw the bodies," the man countered, his finger tightening slightly on the trigger. "No loose ends. Drop the pistol, Sergeant. 2 fingers. Slow and easy. Toss it in the mud." Jordan looked at the man's eyes, barely visible under the hood of his poncho. He was arrogant. He thought he had complete control. That was his first mistake. His second mistake was standing too close to the edge of the rocky overhang. At Jordan's feet, Scout, bleeding, exhausted, and barely able to stand, bared his teeth. Even at death's door, the German shepherd was ready to defend his pack. The man glanced down at the dog for a split second. "Shut that mutt up, or I'll shoot him first." It was a microsecond of distraction, but it wasn't enough to draw and fire. Jordan needed something bigger. She needed the sky to break. She had been counting the seconds between the lightning flashes and the thunderclaps since they left the cabin. The storm was directly overhead. Flash. 1, 2, crash. She waited, her grip on the Glock 19, still pointed down at her side, was ironclad. Suddenly, a brilliant, blinding fork of lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the ridge in stark, terrifying white light. "1, I said drop the gun," the man yelled, blinded for a moment by the flash. 2. Jordan didn't drop the gun. She dropped her weight. Crash. As the thunder detonated in the air, masking all sound, Jordan pivoted hard. She shoved Theo roughly into the wet ferns behind her and brought her right arm up in a blindingly fast arc. She didn't aim for center mass. He was wearing tactical gear. He likely had body armor under the poncho. She aimed low. Bang! The 9mm bullet caught the man right in the exposed pelvic girdle. It was a devastating, paralyzing shot. The man shrieked, his legs giving out instantly. As he collapsed, his finger jerked on the shotgun trigger. Boom! The blast went wide, tearing through the canopy of pine branches above Jordan's head, showering her with pine needles and bark. Before the man could pump another shell into the chamber, Jordan closed the distance. She stepped in, kicking the barrel of the shotgun violently to the side, and pressed the hot muzzle of her Glock directly against the center of his forehead. "I am a wet, scared mom," Jordan whispered, her eyes burning with a lethal fire. "And that makes me the most dangerous thing in these woods." Bang! The man slumped backward, his lifeless body sliding off the slippery, moss-covered edge of the rocky overhang. He plummeted down into the dark abyss of the ravine, disappearing into the storm. Jordan stood there for a second, her chest heaving, rain washing the gunpowder residue from her face. She had survived the ambush, but the shotgun blast had echoed through the valley. It was louder than the thunder. Down by the creek, the flashlight beams stopped moving away. They frantically swept the trees, reorienting. Up the ridge, a faint voice carried on the wind. "They're up on the ridge." The tracking party realized they had been played. And now, they knew exactly where she was. "Mom?" Theo whimpered, peeking out from the ferns. Jordan snapped out of her combat trance. "I'm here, baby. You're safe." She grabbed Theo's hand and urged Scout forward. Just 10 yards away, hidden beneath a tangle of thick, thorny blackberry bushes and a camouflage tarp, was her hunting blind. She pulled the tarp back, revealing a heavy steel door set directly into the rocky hillside. She punched a 4-digit code into the battery-operated keypad. The lock clicked, and she hauled the heavy door open. It was dark, dry, and smelled of earth and gun oil. She pushed Theo and Scout inside, stepping in after them and pulling the heavy door shut. She locked the deadbolt. Jordan clicked on a small, red LED tactical light. The red light wouldn't ruin her night vision. The bunker was small, barely large enough for 3 people to sit comfortably, but it was fortified. She grabbed a wool blanket from a sealed plastic bin and wrapped it tightly around Theo. Then tossed another over Scout, who had collapsed onto the dirt floor, breathing heavily. "We're safe here, Mom?" Theo asked, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "We have the high ground now, buddy," Jordan said softly. She turned to the back wall of the bunker. Mounted on the reinforced concrete was a heavy black lockbox. She keyed it open. Inside lay a custom-built AR-15 rifle. It was equipped with a suppressed barrel, a variable optic scope, and a thermal imaging sight. Beside it were 4 30-round magazines packed with 5.56 green-tip armor-piercing ammunition. Jordan took the rifle down. The familiar, cold weight of the weapon in her hands sent a dark, comforting thrill through her veins. She slapped a magazine into the magwell with a sharp clack, pulled the charging handle, and clicked on the thermal optic. She stepped up to the narrow, reinforced firing slit at the front of the bunker. She opened the steel visor. Looking through the thermal scope, the stormy woods below were painted in cool shades of blue and purple. But moving up the steep, muddy slope, pushing through the trees with relentless fury, were 4 glowing, bright orange silhouettes. They were coming for her. Jordan nestled the stock of the rifle deep into her shoulder. She let out a slow, steady breath. "Welcome to the high ground," she whispered. Inside the concrete and steel walls of the hunting blind, the storm felt a million miles away. The air was dry, smelling faintly of damp earth and the sharp, clean scent of gun oil. Jordan Hale stood at the narrow firing slit, her face illuminated only by the faint, eerie glow of the thermal imaging scope. She controlled her breathing. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. Hold for 4. The tactical box breathing technique slowed her racing heart, bringing her pulse down to a steady, rhythmic thud. Through the thermal lens, the freezing, rain-soaked forest was a canvas of dark blues and cold purples. But moving up the steep, muddy incline, slipping and cursing against the terrain, were four distinct, glowing orange silhouettes. They were radiating heat. They were fighting the mountain, unaware that the mountain was about to fight back. "They're coming, Mom," Theo whispered from the corner of the bunker. He was huddled beneath the wool blanket, his arms wrapped tightly around Scout's neck. "I know, baby," Jordan replied, her voice eerily calm, devoid of the panic that had fueled her flight through the woods. "Cover your ears. It's going to be a little loud." She pressed her cheek against the cold polymer stock of the AR-15. The weapon was an extension of her own body, chambered in 5.56 NATO, loaded with armor-piercing green-tip rounds, and fitted with a heavy-duty titanium suppressor. It wouldn't be completely silent, supersonic rounds always crack, but the suppressor would eliminate the muzzle flash and mask the origin of the shot. In the middle of a thunderstorm, it would sound like nothing more than a snapping branch. Jordan centered the thermal crosshairs on the lowest glowing figure. He was the point man, using a heavy flashlight to track the muddy footprints Jordan had intentionally left before veering off. He was frustrated, yanking his boots out of the thick clay. Distance: 150 yards. Elevation: -30 degrees. Wind: high, blowing west to east. Jordan adjusted her aim slightly to the left to compensate for the wind drift. She settled the crosshairs on the glowing mass of the man's chest. She exhaled slowly, letting all the air out of her lungs. At the natural pause at the bottom of her breath, she squeezed the trigger. Through the scope, the result was instantaneous. The glowing orange silhouette jerked violently backward as the 5.56 round punched through his tactical vest like it was made of paper. His flashlight spun wildly into the air, casting chaotic beams through the rain, before he tumbled backward, rolling lifelessly down the muddy embankment. 1 down, 3 to go. The remaining 3 glowing figures froze. They hadn't heard a gunshot, only the sonic boom of the bullet passing, blending seamlessly with a distant rumble of thunder. "Jackson? Jackson, get up!" a voice yelled from the dark, barely carrying up the hill over the storm. The second man, a tall, heavily built silhouette, broke cover and slid down the mud to check on his fallen comrade. Jordan cycled her breathing. Inhale, hold, exhale. She tracked the second man. He knelt beside the body, his thermal signature merging slightly with the fading heat of the dead man. Jordan saw his head snap up as he realized what had happened. He wasn't looking at a slip and fall. He was looking at a bullet wound. "Sniper, take COV." Jordan's second shot cut his warning short. The heavy impact threw him sideways into a thicket of ferns. His bright orange thermal signature flared wildly as he thrashed in the mud for a few seconds, then slowly began to cool, fading into the dark purple of the forest floor. 2 down. Down on the ridge, absolute chaos erupted. The 2 remaining men finally realized they had walked into a fatal funnel. They were on the side of a steep hill, with no cover, sinking in mud, fighting a ghost who could see perfectly in the dark. The leader, the massive man who had stepped out of the truck first, screamed a command. Both men raised their rifles and began firing blindly up the hill. Sound effect: a rapid, Deafening barrage of unsuppressed automatic gunfire. The deep boom 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 of heavy-caliber rifles echoing through the valley. Bullets shredded the pine canopy above the bunker. Heavy rounds sparked and ricocheted off the reinforced steel plate of Jordan's firing slit, sending high-pitched pings ringing through the small room. Theo whimpered, covering his ears tighter. Scout let out a low, distressed whine. Jordan didn't flinch. She pulled her face back from the firing slit by a few inches to avoid spalling. But she kept her eye glued to the optic. Amateurs spray and pray. Professionals wait for the target to present itself. The gunfire chewed through the trees for a full 10 seconds before their magazines ran dry. They had to stop moving to reload. It was the window she needed. Jordan found the third man hiding behind the thin trunk of a dead birch tree. To the naked eye, he was completely invisible in the pitch-black storm. But to the thermal scope, the tree was freezing cold, and the man pressed against it was glowing like a bonfire. The 5.56 green-tip ammunition was designed specifically to penetrate barriers. A rotting birch tree wasn't going to stop it. Jordan placed the crosshairs directly over the center of the tree trunk, right where the man's chest would be. Exhale. Squeeze. The bullet punched straight through the wood. The glowing figure behind the tree collapsed instantly, folding in on himself like a puppet with its strings cut. 3 down. Suddenly, the leader realized he was the last man standing. The sheer terror radiating from him was almost visible through the thermal lens. He abandoned his rifle. He abandoned his mission. He turned and began a desperate, scrambling run back down the muddy slope, slipping, falling, and crawling on his hands and knees. Jordan tracked him smoothly. She had him dead to rights. The crosshairs rested squarely between his shoulder blades as he retreated. She rested her finger on the trigger. But as she prepared to end it, the man slipped on a massive slick of mud and tumbled hard, sliding all the way down to the bottom of the ravine, crashing into the swollen creek. He scrambled up onto the opposite bank, gasping for air, and pulled something from his tactical vest. A heavy, military-style satellite radio. Through the thermal scope, Jordan watched him press the receiver to his mouth. Even over the storm, the sheer desperation in his voice carried up the valley. Mayday! Mayday! Team 1 is down. I repeat, Team 1 is wiped out. The target is heavily armed on the North Ridge. She has thermal. We need the cleanup crew. Bring the dogs. Bring everyone. Jordan's blood ran ice cold. She squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the radio, shattering it in the man's hand and taking off 2 of his fingers in the process. He screamed, dropping the smoking plastic, and dove blindly into the thick, impassable brush on the other side of the creek, his thermal signature vanishing into the dense, rocky terrain. Jordan lowered the rifle. The clicking of the cooling suppressor was the only sound in the bunker. She turned around, her face pale under the dim red LED light. Theo looked up at her, his eyes wide, trembling under the blanket. Did you get them, Mom? Jordan swallowed the lump of absolute dread forming in her throat. She knelt down, stroking Theo's hair, her hands covered in mud and gunpowder. I got most of them, buddy, she whispered. But the victory was ashes in her mouth. The leader had made the call. These men weren't just a rogue group of killers. They were a tactical team. And a cleanup crew was coming. The cabin was gone. The woods were compromised. And by dawn, this entire mountain was going to be crawling with heavily armed men hunting a single mother and her wounded dog. Jordan looked at the AR-15 in her hands. Then at her son. The defense was over. If they were going to survive the sunrise, they couldn't just hold the line. They had to go to war. The storm broke just before dawn. The torrential downpour softened into a freezing, gray mist that clung to the Washington pines like a shroud. Inside the concrete bunker, the air had grown stale and bitterly cold. Jordan Hale sat on the hard dirt floor, her back against the steel door. Her AR-15 rested across her knees. She hadn't slept a wink. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. Her ribs ached with a deep, bruised throb, and the adrenaline crash had left her feeling hollowed out, running on nothing but pure, maternal instinct. She looked over at the corner. Theo was fast asleep, his small chest rising and falling rhythmically beneath the scratchy wool blanket. Beside him, Scout lay dangerously still. The German shepherd's breathing was shallow and ragged. The makeshift flannel bandage was soaked through, a dark, rust-colored stain against the gray wool. He needs a vet, Jordan thought, a heavy stone of guilt dropping into her stomach. He needs IV fluids and a surgeon. And I can't give him either. She checked her watch. 5:45 a.m. The cleanup crew, the wounded leader had called for wouldn't wait for sunrise. They were professionals cleaning up a mass grave. They would bring thermal drones, tracking dogs, and heavy firepower. A fundamental rule of infantry warfare echoed in Jordan's mind: static defense is a delayed surrender. If they stayed in the bunker, the dogs would sniff out Scout's blood. The men would surround the steel door, blow the hinges with C4, and drop flashbangs into the confined space. It would be a slaughter. She had to move them. But where? Jordan closed her eyes, visualizing the topographic map of her 200 acres. 3/4 of a mile east, the terrain dropped sharply into a deep, limestone ravine carved out by a subterranean creek. Hidden behind a waterfall of runoff was a small, natural cave. It was incredibly hard to find. Damp and freezing, but the running water would mask their scent from the dogs. And the thick rock would shield them from thermal drones. It was a miserable place to hide. But it was the only place they might survive. Jordan gently shook her son's shoulder. Theo. Hey, buddy. Time to wake up. Theo groaned, his eyes fluttering open. He looked around the dim, red-lit bunker, the terror of the previous night flooding back into his wide eyes. Are they gone? Some of them, Jordan said, keeping her voice incredibly steady. But more are coming. We can't stay here, baby. We had to go on a hike. What about Scout? Theo asked, his voice trembling as he looked at the motionless dog. Jordan swallowed hard. She crawled over to the German shepherd and gently stroked his ears. Scout let out a weak, pathetic whine, barely opening his eyes. He didn't have the strength to stand. I'm going to carry him, Jordan said. She took the heavy canvas tarp that had covered the bunker entrance. Using her combat knife, she sliced it into strips and fashioned a crude, sling-like carrier. She managed to roll the 70-pound dog onto the canvas, tying the ends securely across her chest and back, distributing the weight over her shoulders. It was agonizing. The straps dug fiercely into her bruised ribs, making every breath a sharp stab of pain. But she gritted her teeth. Embrace the suck, the Marines always said. Put your hood up, Theo. Stay right behind me. Step exactly where I step. Jordan pushed the heavy steel door open. The forest was a war zone. The storm had ripped massive branches from the trees, littering the ground with debris. Below them in the valley, a thick column of black smoke rose lazily into the gray sky, the smoldering ruins of their cabin. With her AR-15 in her hands, Scout strapped heavily to her back, and Theo clinging to her belt, Jordan Hale stepped out into the misty dawn. The trek to the limestone ravine was a masterclass in evasion and escape. Jordan didn't walk in a straight line. She, hooked, looping back on her own trail to watch her 6 o'clock. She forced them to walk through shallow, freezing streams to wash away their scent. She rubbed crushed pine needles and wet ash from a lightning-struck tree over her and Theo's clothes to mask their human odor. It took them an hour to cover 3/4 of a mile. By the time they reached the edge of the ravine, Jordan was shivering uncontrollably, her muscles burning from the sheer weight of the dog and her gear. The runoff waterfall roared softly over the limestone edge, creating a curtain of gray water. Behind there, Jordan panted, pointing to the dark gap behind the falls. They slipped behind the icy water, stepping into the shallow, dark cave. It was barely 5 feet deep, but it was dry enough. Jordan gently lowered Scout to the stone floor, unbinding the canvas sling. The dog didn't move, just let out a long, shuddering exhale. Jordan took off her tactical jacket, her only layer of real warmth, and wrapped it around Theo, pulling him into the deepest corner of the rock. "Listen to me very carefully, Theo," Jordan said, kneeling in front of him, looking him dead in the eye. "You do not leave this cave. You do not make a sound. Even if you hear shouting, even if you hear shooting, you stay here with Scout until I come back for you." Theo's lower lip quivered. He grabbed her arm with surprising strength. "Where are you going, Mom? Don't leave us." "I have to, baby," she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. She pressed her forehead against his. "If I stay here with you, they will find us all. I have to go out there. I have to make them look the wrong way." She kissed his cold cheek, lingered for a fraction of a second, and pulled away. Jordan stepped out from behind the waterfall. The cold hit her instantly, but the fire burning in her veins kept the shivering at bay. She wasn't running anymore. Jordan froze, tilting her head up toward the gray sky. Thump, 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 thump. It wasn't thunder. It was the heavy, chopping sound of helicopter rotor blades. Through the canopy of the pines, she saw it, a sleek, black Hughes MD-500 helicopter, flying low and fast, sweeping over the western ridge. It didn't have police markings. It was completely unmarked, a private tactical insertion. The cleanup crew had arrived. Jordan checked her AR-15, 30 rounds in the magazine, 2 spare mags on her belt, 1 Glock 19 with 9 rounds, and a combat knife. Against an unknown number of mercenaries with air support, she moved into the thick brush, heading back toward the area where she had shot the leader's radio. She needed to find his blood trail. If she could find him before the extraction team did, she could use him. She found the spot near the swollen creek where the leader had scrambled up the bank. The mud was deeply gouged, and the ferns were splattered with dark, arterial blood from his severed fingers. He was losing blood fast, moving erratically. His trail was incredibly easy to follow. Jordan tracked him for 400 yards, moving silently like a ghost through the mist. The trail led into a dense thicket of old-growth cedars. Suddenly, the blood trail stopped. Jordan dropped to a crouch, raising her rifle, scanning the gray fog. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. Snap! It was the faintest sound of a twig breaking. coming from directly above her. Jordan rolled hard to her left just as a massive, heavy body dropped from the branches of the cedar tree directly onto the spot she had occupied a second before. It was the leader. His face was pale, his right hand wrapped tightly in a bloody rag. But his left hand held a heavy, serrated hunting knife. He had known he was being tracked. He had climbed the tree to set an ambush. He lunged at her, moving with desperate, animalistic fury. Jordan brought the stock of the AR-15 up, blocking the downward thrust of the knife. The blade scraped loudly against the polymer handguard. "You ruined everything," the man spat, his eyes wild, blood loss making him reckless. He threw his entire body weight forward, slamming Jordan back against the trunk of a tree. The rifle was pinned between them. She couldn't shoot. The man gritted his teeth, shifting the knife, aiming for her throat. The blade of the hunting knife inched closer to Jordan's throat. The wounded leader was running on pure, unadulterated adrenaline and the primal fear of a dying man. He was heavier, stronger, and gravity was on his side as he pinned her against the rough bark of the cedar tree. The cold steel of the knife scraped against the polymer handguard of her AR-15, sending a sickening shiver up her arms. "You're dead," the man spit, his face inches from hers, his breath reeking of copper and decay. Jordan didn't waste her breath on a retort. She didn't panic. Panic was for civilians. She remembered her McMAP training, Marine Corps martial arts program. When overpowered by brute strength, attacked the structural weakness. The man was pushing with all his might, using his left hand holding the knife. But his right hand, the one Jordan had shattered with her sniper shot, was heavily bandaged and clumsily gripping the barrel of her rifle for leverage. Jordan stopped fighting his downward pressure. Instead, she abruptly pulled the AR-15 toward her chest and twisted it violently to the right, directly against his mangled fingers. The man let out a blood-curdling shriek. The agonizing pain radiating from his severed digits caused his entire body to seize for a fraction of a second. It was all the time Jordan needed. She let go of the rifle entirely, letting it drop to the mud. With her newly freed right hand, she drew the heavy combat knife from her belt in one fluid, blindingly fast motion. She didn't slash wildly. She drove the pommel of her knife upward, smashing it directly into the soft cartilage of the man's nose. The leader stumbled backward, dropping his own knife, clutching his face as blood poured over his lips. He was completely disoriented, gasping for air. Jordan didn't give him a chance to recover. She stepped forward, sweeping his legs out from under him with a brutal kick to his knee. He crashed onto his back in the wet ferns. Before he could even raise his hands to defend himself, Jordan was kneeling on his chest, the tip of her combat knife resting right at the base of his throat. "Who sent you?" Jordan hissed, her voice colder than the freezing rain. The man choked on his own blood, his eyes wide with the realization that he was utterly defeated. He looked up at the gray sky, where the chopping of the helicopter blades was shaking the pine needles from the trees above them. You don't even know what your mud dug up, do you?" he coughed, a morbid smile twisting his bloody face. It wasn't just some random girl. It was the senator's daughter, the one who went missing last year. Jordan's stomach plummeted. A senator's daughter. The mass grave wasn't just a dumping ground for a local serial killer. It was a cover-up for people with serious power. People who could afford private military contractors and unmarked helicopters. The cleanup crew. The man wheezed, his breathing becoming shallow. "They're not cops, Jordan. They're Blackbriar. Ex-military. Just like you. But they don't have rules. They're going to burn this whole forest to ash to find that evidence, and your little boy." At the mention of Theo, the last shred of mercy in Jordan Hale evaporated. "They won't find him," Jordan whispered, "because I'm going to keep them very busy." She didn't use the knife. She drew her Glock 19 and fired a single, silenced round into his chest. The man's eyes rolled back, and he went completely still. Jordan grabbed her AR-15 from the mud, wiping the receiver clean on her pants. She looked up. Through the canopy, the black underbelly of the Hughes MD-500 helicopter was visible. It was hovering less than 100 yards away, over a small clearing near the smoldering ruins of her cabin. Jordan slapped a fresh magazine into her rifle. She pulled the charging handle. Clack! Through her thermal optic, she watched thick nylon ropes drop from the sides of the chopper. Dark, heavily armed figures began fast roping down into the clearing with terrifying speed and precision. 1, 2, 3, 4. 6 men in total. And as the last man hit the ground, Jordan saw something that made her blood run ice cold. He was holding 2 thick leather leashes. Pulling at the ends of those leashes were 2 massive, muscular Belgian Malinois tracking dogs. If those dogs caught scouts sent from the bunker, they would follow the blood trail straight to the waterfall. They would find the cave. They would find Theo. Jordan had to break their focus. She couldn't let them establish a search grid. She had to become the loudest, most dangerous target in the woods. She had to draw all their aggression onto herself. She took a deep breath of the damp, pine-scented air. She thought of Theo, shivering in the dark, trusting his mother to come back. "Hey, assholes," Jordan muttered to herself, shouldering the rifle. She didn't use the suppressor. She reached up and quickly unthreaded the heavy titanium cylinder from the barrel of her AR-15. Tossing it into the brush. She wanted them to hear this. She wanted them to know exactly where she was. Jordan aimed through the trees, targeting the tail rotor of the hovering helicopter. It was a difficult shot through the branches. But she didn't need to destroy it. She just needed to announce her presence. She flipped the selector switch from semi to burst. Sparks flew wildly from the tail boom of the helicopter as the armor-piercing rounds struck the metal. The pilot instantly banked hard to the left, pulling the chopper up and away from the tree line to avoid taking critical damage. Down in the clearing, the 6 mercenaries instantly dropped into defensive crouches. Their weapons raised. Scanning the tree line, the 2 Belgian Malinois barked furiously, straining against their leashes, looking exactly in Jordan's direction. "Contact, northeast quadrant, 200 yards." One of the mercenaries barked over a comms radio. Jordan didn't wait around to see their return fire. She slung the rifle over her shoulder and began to sprint in the exact opposite direction of the waterfall cave, plunging deeper into the unforgiving, rugged terrain of the Cascade Mountains. The bait was set, the hounds were loose, and the real hunt had just begun. Running from a Belgian Malinois in an open field is suicide. Running from one in a dense forest is just a slower, more exhausting way to die. Jordan Hale knew this. She knew the dogs could run at 30 miles an hour. She knew their bite force could shatter a human femur. But right now, she needed those dogs focused entirely on her. She needed them pulling their handlers as far away from the waterfall cave, and Theo, as physically possible. She sprinted through the rugged, uneven terrain of the Cascade Mountains. Her boots tearing through the wet ferns and sliding in the freezing mud. Her chest burned as if she were breathing in shards of glass. And every jarring step sent a shockwave of agony through her bruised ribs. Crack, snap, behind her, echoing through the gray morning mist, came the sounds of pursuit. Target is moving northeast, keep the pressure on, do not let her go to ground, a voice barked over the tactical comms. Carrying through the quiet, damp woods. Then came the barking, deep, aggressive, and hungry. They had her scent. They had tasted the gunpowder and sweat she left behind. And they were closing the distance. Jordan forced her legs to move faster, dodging massive Douglas fir trunks and vaulting over rotting logs. She checked her compass. She was heading toward Dead Man's Drop, a steep, rocky gorge carved out by a violent, rushing river. It was a natural dead end. A sheer 60-foot drop into jagged rocks and white water. She couldn't outrun them, so she had to funnel them. She had to make them fight on her terms. Jordan burst through the tree line and skidded to a halt. The gorge opened up before her. A treacherous, mist-filled chasm. The river below roared with the fury of the overnight storm. Spanning the 20-foot gap across the gorge was a single, ancient cedar tree that had fallen years ago, its bark stripped bare and slick with green moss. It was a natural bridge, but it was incredibly dangerous. One slip meant a broken neck on the rocks below. Jordan didn't hesitate. She slung her AR-15 tight across her back and stepped onto the slippery, rounded surface of the log. She kept her eyes locked on the opposite side, extending her arms for balance, and moved with rapid, terrifying precision. Halfway across, her right boot slipped on a patch of wet moss. She dropped to one knee, her heart leaping into her throat, hugging the thick wood as the river raged beneath her. She scrambled the rest of the way on all fours, throwing herself onto the muddy bank on the far side of the gorge. She was across, but she wasn't safe. Through the mist on the other side of the gorge, two massive Belgian Malinois burst from the tree line, straining viciously against their thick leather leashes. Two heavily armored Blackbriar mercenaries emerged right behind them, their boots digging into the mud to keep the dogs from lunging over the edge. There, across the gorge, the first handler yelled, pointing a gloved finger at Jordan. Jordan knelt behind a large boulder, leveling her AR-15 over the top of the wet stone. She had a clear shot at the handlers, but the distance was 80 yards. The mist was thick, and she had ditched her suppressor. If she missed, they would lay down a wall of suppressing fire and call in the helicopter. "Release the hound, flush her out," the second handler commanded. Click. The first handler unclipped the heavy brass carabiner from the dog's collar. The Malinois didn't hesitate. It didn't analyze the danger of the slippery log or the sheer drop. It was a missile locked onto a target. The dog leapt onto the fallen cedar and began sprinting across the moss-covered bridge, its claws digging into the soft wood with terrifying speed. Jordan's breath caught. She was a dog lover. Scout was her family. Looking at the beautiful, deadly animal charging toward her, a pang of profound hesitation hit her chest. "It's a weapon," her Marine training screamed at her. "It's not a pet. It's a weapon designed to kill you." The dog crossed the midpoint of the log. 40 yards. 30. Jordan didn't aim at the dog. She aimed slightly above it, focusing her sights on the handler standing on the opposite bank, watching his animal advance. She squeezed the trigger. Bang! Bang! 2 unsuppressed 5.56 rounds cracked through the damp air. The handler on the far side jerked backward as a bullet struck him squarely in the shoulder, spinning him into the mud. But the dog didn't flinch at the gunfire. It cleared the log, launching itself off the wood and onto Jordan's side of the gorge. It was 10 yards away. 5. The Malinois lunged, a 60-pound mass of muscle and teeth flying through the air, aiming directly for Jordan's throat. Jordan dropped her rifle. She didn't have time to draw her pistol. She threw her left arm up, wrapping it entirely in the thick, reinforced fabric of her tactical jacket, and shoved it directly into the dog's open jaws. The Malinois clamped down. The bite force was agonizing, the canine teeth piercing through the heavy nylon and sinking deep into the meat of her forearm. The sheer kinetic energy of the dog's leap slammed Jordan backward into the mud. She screamed, but she didn't fight to pull her arm away. Tearing away would rip her muscles to shreds. She let the dog commit to the bite, pinning it against her chest. With her right hand free, she reached down to her tactical belt. She didn't draw a knife. She drew her high-lumen, military-grade strobe flashlight. She jammed the heavy bezel of the flashlight directly into the dog's ear and hit the power button. A blinding, pulsating strobe of 2,000 lumens exploded inches from the animal's eyes. Combined with the hard metallic pressure against its sensitive ear canal, the sensory overload was instantaneous. The dog yelped, releasing its agonizing grip on her arm. Completely disoriented and temporarily blinded, it scrambled backward, whining and shaking its head. Jordan didn't kill it. She scrambled to her feet, clutching her bleeding left arm to her chest. Across the gorge, the second handler realized his dog had failed. He raised his short-barreled rifle, aiming across the chasm. "Take her down," he roared. Jordan grabbed her AR-15 with her good hand, ducking low, and dove into the thickest part of the brush. Stone splinters rained down on her as bullets shattered the boulder she had been using for cover. She had survived the dog, but she was bleeding badly. Her left arm practically useless. The gunfire echoing through the valley meant the rest of the Blackbriar team, and the helicopter, would be converging on this exact location within minutes. She looked back at the fallen cedar log. The second handler was hooking his wounded partner to his harness, preparing to drag him to safety. The other dog was barking furiously, waiting for the command to cross. They thought they had her trapped on this side of the gorge. Jordan smiled, a dark, bloody, terrifying smile. She reached into one of her tactical pouches and pulled out a small, green plastic brick, a block of C4 explosive she had taken from the dead leader's tactical vest during their fight. She pressed a remote detonator into the soft explosive. "You want to cross?" Jordan whispered, her eyes cold. "Come on over." She tossed the block of C4 out from the brush. It landed perfectly in the center of the rotting cedar log. She turned her back to the gorge, holding the small remote detonator in her bloody hand, and started walking away into the mist. 5 seconds later, the second handler ordered the remaining dog to cross. Jordan pressed the button. The bridge was gone. The Blackbriar team was officially cut off from her side of the mountain. Jordan Hale didn't look back. She clutched her bleeding arm, disappearing into the dark Washington pines. She had bought Theo and Scout time, but the clock was still ticking, and the helicopter was already circling back. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the pain was settling in with a vengeance. Jordan Hale leaned heavily against the damp trunk of a towering Douglas fir, sliding down until she hit the wet earth. She looked at her left arm. The heavy tactical jacket was shredded. Beneath the torn nylon, the Belgian Malinois had done severe damage. Deep, jagged puncture wounds leaked dark red blood, soaking the sleeve of her thermal Henley. Her fingers were numb, and her grip strength was fading fast. If she didn't stop the bleeding, she would go into hypovolemic shock in less than 30 minutes. She gritted her teeth, ignoring the burning agony, and reached to her tactical belt with her good hand. She ripped a CAT, combat application tourniquet, from its pouch. Slipping the nylon loop over her injured arm, she pulled it high above the bicep, strapped the Velcro tight, and twisted the windlass rod. A new, suffocating wave of pain washed over her as the blood flow to her lower arm was violently restricted. She locked the rod in place. It wasn't a permanent fix, and keeping it on too long meant risking amputation. But it kept her alive. She wrapped the torn sleeve tightly with duct tape to keep dirt out of the open wounds. "Stay frosty, Sergeant," she whispered to herself, her forehead resting against her muddy knees. "Theo is waiting." Suddenly, the ground beneath her began to vibrate. Jordan snapped her head up. The Black Hughes MD-500 helicopter wasn't just searching the perimeter anymore. It was hunting her. Through the canopy, she saw it banking sharply over the trees. Mounted on the nose of the chopper was a spherical pod, a FLIR, forward-looking infrared, camera. The Blackbriar mercenaries had realized they couldn't track her on the ground with the dogs. So they were bringing the eye in the sky to a FLIR camera. Jordan's body heat in the freezing rain would shine like a lighthouse. She couldn't outrun it. She couldn't hide from it. The canopy was too thin here. If she wanted to survive, she had to ground that bird. Jordan hauled herself to her feet, her AR-15 heavy in her right hand. She scanned the terrain. About 200 yards to the west, the forest opened up into an old, abandoned logging clear-cut, a massive, bowl-shaped depression in the mountain, surrounded by sheer, rocky cliffs on three sides. It was a dead end, but it was also a perfect kill box. Jordan moved as fast as her battered body would allow, scrambling up the steep, treacherous backside of the highest cliff overlooking the clear cut. Her left arm hung uselessly at her side, forcing her to climb the slick, mossy rocks with one hand in her knees. Her fingernails cracked and bled as she clawed her way to the summit. When she finally pulled herself over the edge, she lay flat on the cold stone, panting heavily. She was 50 feet above the floor of the clearing. She had the high ground. She reached into her vest and pulled out an emergency road flare. With her teeth, she pulled the cap off and struck the igniter. The flare burned at over 2,000 degrees. To a thermal camera, it would create a massive, blinding bloom of heat, completely masking any human signature near it. Jordan tossed the burning flare straight down. It tumbled through the air and landed directly in the center of the muddy logging clearing, casting a demonic red glow against the gray mist. Then, she waited. She didn't have to wait long. The helicopter pilot, seeing the massive heat signature erupt on his FLIR monitor, immediately banked the Hughes MD-500 toward the clearing. The black helicopter hovered into the bowl-shaped depression, descending to just 30 feet above the ground to investigate the red smoke. The side doors were open, and Jordan could see the mercenaries leaning out, their rifles raised, scanning the mud below. They were looking down. They never thought to look up. Jordan rested the handguard of her AR-15 on the edge of the cliff. She didn't aim at the mercenaries. She didn't aim at the armored underbelly. She aimed straight down through the plexiglass canopy of the cockpit, directly at the pilot. Exhale. Jordan unleashed hell. The 5.56 green-tip armor-piercing rounds shattered the top of the cockpit canopy like spun glass. The pilot was killed instantly. Without his hands on the cyclic and collective controls, the helicopter became a 50-foot, multi-ton brick. The aircraft violently jerked to the right, the main rotor blades, spinning at hundreds of revolutions per minute, slammed directly into the solid rock face of the cliff just below Jordan. The sheer force of the impact ripped the tailboom completely off. The chassis of the helicopter spun wildly out of control, plummeting the remaining 20 feet to the ground. It slammed into the mud of the clearing with a sickening crunch, instantly erupting into a massive fireball of aviation fuel. A shockwave of heat washed over the cliff edge, forcing Jordan to duck her head. She peered over the edge. The black beast was dead. The wreckage burned violently in the rain, a twisted pile of scorched metal and black smoke. None of the men inside could have survived that impact. Jordan slowly pushed herself up, her breathing ragged. She had done the impossible. She had taken down a heavily armed helicopter with a rifle and a flare. But her victory was brief. Through the roar of the burning wreckage, a faint, metallic voice drifted up from the valley. It wasn't coming from the helicopter. It was coming from the woods. "Command, this is Ground Team Alpha. We have a visual on the crash site. The bird is down. I repeat, the bird is down. We have visual on the shooter. She's on the north cliff face." Jordan froze. She looked down past the burning wreck, into the tree line at the edge of the clearing. Emerging from the mist, their laser sights cutting through the smoke like red surgical scalpels, were at least a dozen heavily armed Blackbriar contractors. They hadn't all been in the helicopter. The main ground force had finally arrived. And she was out of places to run. Jordan looked at her AR-15. She ejected the magazine. 3 rounds left. She checked her Glock. 5 rounds. Her left arm was completely dead. And the tourniquet was burning like acid. She was a mother. She was a Marine. And she was going to make them pay for every single inch of this mountain. 3 rounds in the AR-15. 5 rounds in the Glock 19. A dead left arm, wrapped in a blood-soaked tourniquet. And 12 heavily armed Blackbriar contractors advancing through the mist, their red laser sights slicing through the black smoke of the burning helicopter like the eyes of hungry wolves. Jordan Hale lay flat on her stomach on the rocky cliff overlooking the clear cut. She didn't feel the freezing rain anymore. She didn't feel the jagged rocks biting into her ribs. She was entering the final stage of physical exhaustion. A place where the body shuts down and only the soul keeps the engine running. "I am not going to survive this mountain," she thought. The realization didn't bring panic. It brought a strange, cold clarity. But neither are they. She looked down at the 12 men. They were fanning out, moving in a practiced tactical wedge formation. They were sweeping the base of the cliff, looking for a path up to her position. Jordan couldn't shoot 12 men with 8 bullets. But she was a Marine. And Marines know that you don't always shoot the enemy. Sometimes, you shoot the earth beneath their feet. She rolled onto her back, groaning as the bruised ribs ground together, and looked straight up. Towering another 40 feet above her position on the cliff face was a massive, unstable overhang of shale and limestone. It was deeply fractured, weakened by years of freezing winters, and vibrating violently from the earlier explosion of the helicopter. Jordan shifted her AR-15, resting the barrel on her bent right knee to stabilize it. She aimed not at the men below, but at the deep, dark fissure in the limestone overhang directly above the advancing tactical team. "For Theo," she whispered. The 3 5.56 armor-piercing rounds struck the exact same stress point in the limestone, acting like a chisel driven by a sledgehammer. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, the mountain groaned. "Rockslide! Move! Move!" one of the mercenaries screamed below. But there was nowhere to move. The entire upper face of the cliff gave way. Tons of jagged limestone, shale, and uprooted trees cascaded down the sheer drop, slamming into the bowl-shaped clearing with apocalyptic force. A massive cloud of gray dust and debris exploded outward, mixing with the thick black smoke of the burning aviation fuel. The sound was deafening, burying the screams of the men caught directly underneath the avalanche. Jordan clung to the edge of her ledge, burying her face in her arms as the shockwave of the slide shook the very foundation of the cliff. Showered in dust and small rocks, she waited until the violent rumbling finally subsided. She coughed, tasting pulverized stone and copper. She wiped the dirt from her eyes and peered over the edge. The logging clear-cut was a vision of hell. Half of the clearing was buried under a massive mound of shattered rock. The Blackbriar Wedge formation was completely broken. At least 5 of the men had been crushed instantly. But through the suffocating cloud of dust and smoke, the red laser sights began to pierce the darkness once again. 7 men were still alive. Bruised, battered, and furious, they emerged from the edges of the rockslide. And now, they knew exactly where she was. And they knew she was out of rifle ammo. "Up the slope, pin her down," the lead contractor roared, firing a burst of automatic fire up at Jordan's ledge. Bullets chipped the rock inches from her face, showering her with deadly shrapnel. Jordan let the empty AR-15 drop to the ground. She drew her Glock 19 with her right hand. 5 rounds left. She couldn't stay on the ledge. They would flank her in minutes. She had to take the fight into the fog. She had to become a ghost again. Jordan slid backward, found a steep, narrow goat path leading down the side of the cliff, and descended rapidly, slipping and sliding until she hit the floor of the clear cut, disappearing straight into the thickest part of the smoke and dust. Visibility was down to less than 10 feet. The air was thick, toxic, and hot. Jordan crouched low, her dead left arm tucked tight against her chest. The Glock raised. Out of the gray fog, a dark silhouette materialized just 5 feet away. A mercenary, his rifle raised, scanning the smoke. He didn't see her in the ash. Jordan didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, raising the pistol. Bang! A single shot to the gap in his body armor under the armpit. The man dropped without a sound. 4 rounds left. Instantly, the other men reacted to the gunshot. Contact. Center of the smoke. A wall of blind suppressing fire ripped through the gray cloud. Bullets tore through the smoke, pinging off the rocks and the twisted metal of the helicopter. Jordan dove behind the burning tail boom of the chopper, feeling the intense heat blistering her wet skin. "Squeeze her in, flash and clear," a voice commanded. 2 small, metallic cylinders bounced through the smoke, landing a few feet from her position. Flashbangs. Jordan squeezed her eyes shut and opened her mouth to equalize the pressure. Even behind cover, the shockwave hit her like a physical blow. Her vision swam, and her balance vanished. She slumped heavily against the hot metal of the wreckage, her right hand trembling violently as she tried to keep her pistol aimed at the edge of the smoke. Through the ringing in her ears, she saw 3 heavily armored figures breach the smoke wall, moving in perfect unison. Jordan raised the Glock. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely align the sights. Bang! She missed. Bang! The bullet sparked harmlessly off a ballistic helmet. Bang! Bang! She was out. The 3 men stopped advancing. They saw the slide lock back. They saw the blood dripping from her tourniquet. They saw a woman broken, battered, and utterly defenseless. The man in the center lowered his rifle slightly. He pulled a heavy combat knife from his chest rig. "You put up a hell of a fight, Hale," he said, his voice muffled by a balaclava. "But it's over. Tell me where the kid is, and I'll make this quick." Jordan Hale didn't cry. She didn't beg. She looked at the empty pistol in her hand. She let it drop to the ash-covered mud. Slowly, agonizingly, she reached down to her belt and unsheathed her own combat knife with her right hand. She held it in a reverse grip, the blade resting against her forearm. She stood up straight, ignoring the burning agony in her ribs and the useless weight of her dead arm. She looked the mercenary dead in the eyes, the fire of the burning helicopter reflecting in her dark pupils. "Come find out," Jordan whispered. "Come find out," Jordan whispered. The words tasted like ash and copper. She held the combat knife in a reverse grip, her right arm trembling under the sheer weight of her exhaustion. Her left arm was completely numb, the tourniquet burning a ring of fire around her bicep. The 3 Blackbriar mercenaries didn't laugh. They didn't taunt her. They were professionals, and they recognized the look in her eyes. It was the look of a cornered predator that had already accepted death, which meant she was going to take at least one of them with her. The lead mercenary tightened his grip on his own serrated blade. He lowered his center of gravity, preparing to lunge. Jordan shifted her weight, ignoring the agonizing grind of her broken ribs. "One strike," she told herself. "Aim for the carotid artery. Protect the face. Die standing." The mercenary pushed off his back foot, launching himself forward through the gray smoke. Jordan braced for the impact. The mercenary never reached her. Mid-lunge, a massive .308 sniper round tore through the side of his Kevlar helmet. His body jerked violently to the left, his momentum carrying him face first into the muddy ash at Jordan's feet. He didn't move again. Jordan froze, her knife still raised. The 2 remaining mercenaries scrambled backward in pure panic, dropping into a crouch and raising their rifles toward the cliff face. They searched the smoke, but the shot hadn't come from Jordan. It had come from the ridge above. Suddenly, the gray mist above the logging clear-cut was painted in blinding flashes of red and blue. A voice, magnified by a heavy-duty police megaphone, boomed down from the top of the cliff, echoing like the voice of God in the canyon. "Armed individuals in the clearing. This is the FBI hostage rescue team and Washington State Police. Drop your weapons immediately and put your hands on your heads. You are surrounded." The 2 mercenaries looked at each other. They looked at the dead man at their feet. They looked up at the ridge, where dozens of tactical laser sights were now painting their chests in a sea of red dots. The private military contractors weren't being paid enough to fight the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Both men slowly raised their hands and laced their fingers behind their heads. dropping to their knees in the mud. Jordan Hale stared at them. The adrenaline that had kept her standing for the last 8 hours instantly evaporated. The combat knife slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the ground with a dull clink. Her knees buckled, the world tilted sideways, the gray sky spinning wildly as she collapsed onto her back in the freezing ash. The next 20 minutes were a blur of sound and motion. Heavily armored SWAT officers flooded the clearing, securing the mercenaries and sweeping the burning wreckage. Flashlights pierced the smoke. Shouts of "Clear!" echoed through the pines. A team of tactical medics rushed to Jordan's side. Hands were on her, cutting away her ruined tactical jacket, applying pressure dressings, checking her pupils. Pulse is thready. We've got massive blood loss from a K9 bite. Broken ribs. Severe exhaustion. A paramedic yelled over the noise. Get a backboard. We need to medevac her now. No, Jordan rasped, her voice barely a whisper. She fought weakly against the medic trying to secure her shoulders. No. Ma'am, you need to lay still. You are going into shock. I said no. Jordan suddenly grabbed the paramedic's collar with her right hand, her eyes snapping open with terrifying intensity. My son is in the woods. The circle of medics parted as a familiar face pushed through the crowd. Sheriff Miller. He looked haggard, his uniform soaked in rain and mud, holding a heavy radio. Jordan, Miller said, dropping to his knees beside her. His voice was thick with emotion. We heard the explosion on the bridge. We brought everyone. The FBI. They're unearthing the grave now. You exposed the whole damn thing. You're safe. Miller. Jordan choked out, tears finally breaking through the dirt and blood on her face. Theo. At the limestone ravine, behind the waterfall. You had to take me to him. We'll send a team. No, he won't come out for them. He'll only come out for me. Seeing the absolute, unbreakable resolve in the mother's eyes, Miller nodded. Get her in the ATV. He ordered the medics. Wrap her up. We're going to the ravine. The mist was finally beginning to lift. Pale morning sunlight filtering through the Washington pines. The police ATV stopped 20 yards from the limestone drop-off. Flanked by Sheriff Miller and 2 FBI agents, Jordan stumbled toward the roaring curtain of water. She was wrapped in a thick foil thermal blanket, her left arm heavily bandaged and slung to her chest, her face pale as a ghost. But she stood tall. She stopped at the edge of the water. The cave behind the falls was pitch black. She took a deep, shuddering breath. Theo, she called out, her voice echoing over the rushing water. Silence. Theo, she called again, a little louder. Nothing but the wind. The FBI agents exchanged a nervous glance. Jordan's heart seized. Had the dogs found them? Had the cold taken them? She stepped closer to the water. Theo, it's Mom. From the darkness behind the waterfall, a small, trembling shadow emerged. Theo stepped out into the morning light. He was wrapped in Jordan's oversized tactical jacket, clutching his muddy teddy bear. His face was streaked with dirt and tears, but he was completely unharmed. Mommy, he screamed. He ran forward, his little boots splashing through the shallow puddles, and threw himself against her legs. Jordan collapsed to her knees, wrapping her good arm around him, burying her face in his neck, sobbing uncontrollably. The Marine was gone, the tactician was gone, there was only a mother, holding her entire world in her arms. I've got you, she cried, rocking him back and forth. I'm here. It's over. Then, a low, Weak whine came from the cave. Sheriff Miller waded into the water. A moment later, he emerged carrying 70 pounds of muddy, blood-soaked German Shepherd. Scout's eyes were half closed. But as he saw Jordan and Theo, his tail gave a faint, slow thump against the sheriff's chest. "We've got a vet tech at the staging area." Miller smiled gently. "He's going to make it. Jordan, he's a tough son of a bitch. Just like his mom. They tell you that when you leave the war, you leave the war behind." Jordan Hale knew that was a lie. The war had followed her to the edge of the world. It had knocked on her door in the middle of a storm. Wrapped in the guise of powerful men trying to bury their sins. The investigation would make national headlines. The Blackbriar Group was dismantled, and a corrupt senator was brought to justice. The bodies in the woods were finally given their names back. Jordan lost her cabin. She lost the illusion of a perfect, quiet peace. But as she sat in the back of the ambulance, watching the morning sun break fully over the Cascade Mountains, holding her son's hand while Scout rested his heavy head on her boots, she realized she hadn't lost what mattered. She hadn't just survived the monsters in the woods. She had taught them to fear her. And out here, in the whispers of the pines, her family was finally, truly, safe.